Hello, this is Brian Vanderjack, and this is Project Stakeholder Management. With respect to the terms of this presentation, it is provided as is. Use at your own risk. I am not responsible for incidental or consequential damages, and there is no warranty. First, we'll discuss stakeholder basics. And what is a stakeholder? Well, according to the PMBOK 6th edition, page 723, it is an individual, group, or organization that may affect or be affected by or perceive itself to be affected by a decision, activity, or outcome of a project, program, or portfolio. So basically, a stakeholder is anyone that can consider themselves to be impacted. And does a stakeholder necessarily have to be positively impacted? No. According to this definition, a stakeholder could also be somebody who's negatively impacted. For example, scientific evidence is showing there is something called climate change, and everybody on the planet is a stakeholder to whatever events are associated with that climate change, either good or bad. With regard to the stakeholder engagement plan, which is part of the project management plan, it establishes how stakeholders will be engaged in project decisions and executions according to their needs, interests, and impacts. And just as a friendly reminder, the project management plan has a list of about 10 or 12 separate items that determine how the project will be managed. With respect to identification of stakeholders, that is identifying the people, groups, or organizations that are impacted by the project, documenting stakeholder information, and defining how stakeholders could affect the project. About project stakeholders, they are people or groups that are affected by the project. Stakeholders can exert influence over the project, especially the people with the money or the politically powerful or executive management. Identify them early in the project. In fact, the earlier you identify project stakeholders, the better. One time we identified at a company I was working for that an application was to be part of the solution set. Unfortunately, during architecture, that application was totally overlooked. So when we were doing end-to-end testing and we determined that we were missing that application, it actually delayed the implementation of the project by 4 weeks. So it is very essential that you identify all stakeholders, especially in IT. You have to identify all your impacted applications early in the project. Stakeholder management strategy is important. Basically, now that you've got the stakeholders, how the heck are you going to keep them in line? You want to classify your stakeholders according to their interests, influence, and expected involvement. And expected involvement, here's an excellent example. Let's say you're building a tower in downtown Chicago, and you're going to be building that tower right on some brand new property that was just opened up. Let's say that the city of Chicago just opened up Oak Street Beach to you for building a tower. Some stakeholders who are going to get involved would be on the Gold Coast, who will no longer have an awesome view of the lake. And again, what we will be doing is classifying those stakeholders according to the involvement. And in the situation that I'm mentioning, their involvement will be to try to do their very best to stop your project. Stakeholder analysis, you want to identify all potential stakeholders and information about them. Key stakeholders are decision makers, they are managers, and they are the primary customers. You want to interview these stakeholders to identify if there are even more stakeholders involved. But again, you have your key stakeholders, and those are the ones you're going to want to spend your most time with. According to the PMBOK 6th edition, Stakeholder analysis is a technique of systematically gathering and analyzing quantifiable and qualitative information to determine whose interests should be taken into account throughout the project. Again, with positive stakeholders, the ones with the money, the executive management who are driving the project, those are probably the ones you're going to want to be listening to as long as the requests are ethical and legal. And the ones you're going to want to probably try to ignore or mitigate their voices are the ones that are opposed to your project. What is a stakeholder register? Well, a stakeholder register is a document including the identification, assessment, and classification of project stakeholders. It is an easy way to think of this is as a contact list with some extra information just beyond name, role, and how to reach them information. What is a stakeholder register? Well, according to the PMBOK 6th edition on page 723, it is a project document including the identification, assessment, and classification of project stakeholders. And what you'll find is it's easy to understand a stakeholder register if you think about it as just being a contact list. For example, the contact list you have on your smartphone. As for the assessment part of the stakeholder register, what you're supposed to do there is identify if they're helping your project, neutral towards your project, indifferent, or if they're adversely impacting your project. Reality time, you probably want to be as polite as you can as you're documenting the potential impact of the stakeholder on your project, that is in the assessment part of the stakeholder, because documents sometimes get out of the project team and into the general circulation, and you want to be as polite as possible so that should one of the stakeholders you're not particularly fond of ever actually see your list of project stakeholders, they won't be mad at you. More on the stakeholder register: identification information, assessment information, and stakeholder classification. Planning related to stakeholders. So, with regard to planned stakeholder management, here's the general idea. You want to develop management strategies for stakeholder engagement. You want to do an analysis of stakeholder needs and create a clear plan for managing the stakeholders who impact your project. And plan stakeholder engagement as defined by the PMBOK on page 713, it is a process of developing approaches to involve project stakeholders based on their needs, expectations, and interests, and potential impact to the project. Possible stakeholders, and this is a really good list to use if ever you are developing a contact list. Stakeholders include senior management, project team members, organizational resources, identified key stakeholders, project managers, subject matter experts, regulatory bodies, and another one I'd like to add to this list is thought leaders. And thought leaders are those people that always tend to have the bigger picture and always tend to have the best answer in a meeting during a conversation. You want to definitely include those, and a really good stakeholder to add, especially if you're in a large environment with many applications, you always want to identify the impacted applications as soon as possible. With respect to stakeholder analysis, let's pull up the grid here. You'll notice over there at the top right is the closely managed category, the category in red. That would be the top right. And those would be the powerful people with respect to your project who have a high level of interest. And based on something called the Pareto rule, we can assume that 20% of your stakeholders will be in the manage closely quadrant, and that 80% of your time will be spent on the top right quadrant. Those are the people you want to spend most of your time with, because those are the ones who are going to be most likely to control your budget, and those are the people that are most likely to define at the end of your effort if your project was successful. Now, as for the other remaining 20% of your time, so we want to spend 80% of our time in this upper right category, how about these other guys? Well, don't forget to spend that 20% of the time with those other people in the other quadrants. They will start to feel ignored, and they will become unresponsive to you and your project's needs. In other words, say you have an emergency and you're trying to contact one of these people in these little quadrants over here, not the manage closely quadrant. You pick up the phone and you say, I need something right away, and you have not talked to them in 6 months since your project began. Guess what? They're probably not going to want to talk to you. So in the quadrants, keep satisfied, monitor, and keep informed, you may discover a subject matter expert or a thought leader. So of your remaining 20% of your time, I recommend spending 80% of that with 20% of these people and keep them engaged. In other words, who are the hot shots over here? And of the 20% that you have left over here of all your time, you're not just going to equally split up that 20% of your time between all this. No, you're going to break that 20% down again into using the 80-20 rule, and you're going to spend 80% of that remaining 20% with your thought leaders, your subject matter experts, and other people that happen to fall in the keep satisfied, monitor, and keep informed quadrants. Stakeholder engagement levels, you're going to have stakeholders who are totally unaware. For example, a government report came out on the climate change on Friday of 2018, the day after Thanksgiving, and I was on a conference call and I mentioned it, and only one person was aware of the climate change report. So everybody else was totally unaware. So apparently not a big deal in their minds. They might be resistant. They might be neutral, they just don't care either way. You might have supportive people about a project. Now, what supportive people tend to be are the people with the cash that are paying for the project, friendly executive managers, and those kinds of people. And of course, you have people leading the project as possibly thought leaders, subject matter experts, architects might be in leadership roles, directing and guiding the project to where it needs to be. Reviewing the stakeholder management plan, desired and current engagement levels, scope and impact of change to the stakeholders, identification of interrelationships and potential overlap, stakeholder communication requirements, information to be distributed, reason for the distribution of that information, and time frame and frequency for the distribution of the required information. What are we trying to say there? Well, I think the most important takeaway from this slide is you will want to keep your stakeholders informed, and certain groups of stakeholders are going to need a different kind of information. For example, executives love one slide PowerPoint statuses of projects that include what's the name of the project, why the company wants this project, what are the major milestones, are you on target for your major milestones, what are your major upcoming risk events, are you expecting any issues, and are you expecting any support from management. Those are the kinds of things that a manager wants to have. So again, based on the particular level of person engaged, they're going to want a different level of information, and your stakeholder management plan would identify what kind of communications get shared. With respect to managed stakeholder engagement, according to the PMBOK on page 710, is the process of communicating and working with stakeholders to meet their needs and expectations, address issues, and foster appropriate stakeholder involvement. Manage stakeholder engagement. Manage stakeholder engagement. Here's the general idea. Engaging stakeholder as needed in the project. You want to obtain, confirm, and maintain stakeholder commitment to the project. An easy way to maintain stakeholder commitment to the project is for those people on your project team, be sure to always have, for a formal waterfall project, at least a once a week status meeting. And in the status meeting, you're simply going to go down your project schedule, your Gantt chart, and ask, are you on schedule or not? And don't allow detailed conversations at that meeting. Rather, if people want to start having detailed conversations, encourage them to have a totally separate meeting for those detailed conversations, and at that time identify who should be included in those conversations. Managing stakeholder expectations, huge, because stakeholders sometimes may not realize what they're asking for just is not technically possible yet. You want to address potential concerns. Unfortunately, concerns are not always easy to spot. Clarifying and resolving issues. There's always going to be an issue on your project, and what you want to do is document all of your issues on an Excel spreadsheet, identify when the issue came around. You want to identify who is responsible for updating that issue, and on a week-by-week basis, probably as part of your status meeting, you want to update the progress on that issue, and the person whose name is on that issue as the owner is the one who's going to update you. Now, here's a little secret about Excel you may not be aware of, and Excel is where I recommend entering your issues unless you have a specific tool you have to use where you work, is if you hit the alternate key on your keyboard and you press enter, you will start a new line within a Excel cell. So what you'll do is, first thing you'll do is you put down a date, and then you put the status, and then the next time you're having your status meeting, you hit the alternate key and the enter, and then that goes to the next line. You put the date, and then you put the status, etc., etc., until what you start to actually do is you start to build a history on that particular issue. And one thing I forgot to mention is you want to put the status on the issue, which would be open or closed or whatever turns you on. Methodologies to keep stakeholders engaged. This is huge. This might be honestly the most important slide here. Interpersonal skills, which are building trust. The easiest way in IT to build trust is just to do what you say you're going to do. Don't overcommit, don't undercommit, right commit. And by right commit, what I mean is tell them what you can do and do it. Resolving conflict. By the time you actually have to resolve a conflict, it's kind of too late. What you want to do is at the start of your project, you want to have a list of expectations that the whole team will abide by called the social contract. And in the social contract, you want to identify specifically how you're going to resolve conflict. And when you have conflict, make sure to drive it to conflict over technical issues, not to people issues. And a way to drive it to technical issues is if you have a conflict over a technical issue, in the top of your document where you're going to describe what's going on, you're going to describe the problem, and you're going to identify all the possible options that the team comes up with. And then for each option, you're going to honestly identify the positives and the negatives for each solution. And what I've found is when you actually follow this process for conflict resolution, the actual resolution becomes crystal clear after a while. And if the team can't come to a solid resolution, what you can do is you can utilize the pro and con list, the positive and negatives for the various solutions, and present your strongest solutions to your executive managers or to your clients and say, this is what the team has identified. You probably know more about the overall organization than we do. What do you recommend? And definitely never, ever, ever go to a client or an executive and just say, we don't have any plans, because you have no idea what they're going to come up with and you will look like you're not doing your job. Rather, always, when you're going to be asking for help from executives or clients, have at least some kind of a plan. They may throw it aside and do something totally different, but again, at least if you have something, it'll give them something to start with. They might like your suggestions and pick one, or they could use that information that you supply as a place to start. There's two separate ways to active listen. Number one is for technical things. What I recommend highly is echo back what you hear, and if it starts to get really complicated, echo back to them what you hear in an email or a document and get them to confirm before you start treating that document as legitimate. If it's just a casual conversation, active listening is simply the process of paying attention as they're speaking. Don't have your cell phone out, don't be texting people. And some people might say that, yeah, echo back to them what they say or ask engaging questions, but the reality is if you're truly interested in what they have to say, you don't have to work on active listening because you're already actively listening and asking them clarifying questions that you already know the answer to is going to be pretty annoying during a casual conversation. This is huge in terms of interpersonal skills. We, as project managers, as scrum masters, as team leaders, we are change agents. We've heard a lot about what a change agent is. We are the change agents. And there are people who have a vested interest in leaving things as is. They want to leave things at the status quo. It is up to us to overcome their resistance. And an easy way to do that is to explain to them the positive benefits, the benefits to the organization, the vision of the organization, the mission. In reality, some people just may still not be happy because you're moving their cheese, which is a famous book written a long time ago called Who Moved My Cheese? And the idea of that book is at some point there's going to be some change that's going to alter what you consider to be valuable, and the problem then becomes, what are you going to do then? Management skills can also help keep stakeholders engaged, which is facilitate consensus, influence people, negotiate agreements, or modify organizational expectations and behaviors to accept the project outcomes. And this is very difficult to do, especially from a project manager's perspective. To change behaviors, you almost have to have executives engaged, because executives are those people that can actually modify cultural behavior. Controlling stakeholder engagement, you can monitor overall stakeholder relationships, adjust the stakeholder management strategies, update the stakeholder management plan, and you realize that just because you have your written stakeholder control written down plan, you're going to have to at some point alter it and improve it, and it does evolve as the project continues. And with that, I would like to say that I wish you the very best on all projects that you work on, and I wish you even more success in keeping your stakeholder community happy. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.